Welcome to another episode. We as Ecommerce are trying to be a thought leader in our space for supply chain from China for small parcels. I'm here together with Dayu and myself, Simon, with another episode. And this one is actually an extension of episode 16, where the Minimis was announced, but actually things have changed after the election. But what does that mean? What has actually changed? What is the latest news about this? This episode is recorded in November, and we're going to get this out there. But it's very important for you to understand what is now the latest update when it comes to the regulations for imports to the US. Okay, Dayu, good to have you here. I know you've been reading up on this whole topic of what's changing with the regulations ever since the Minimis announcement, ever since the elections, ever since the latest tweet from Trump right now, actually today. There has been some changes and adjustments and announcements. Can you share a little bit more of what's been announced and how to navigate this and what's actually real and what's fake?
Yeah, sure. And let me actually first give a brief history, starting with the previous episode that Simon referenced, which we'll link to it below. You should check that out as well in terms of where we are at now. So to clarify, we are actually filming this November 26th. 2024. So depending on when you actually watch this recording or listen to the podcast, it's probably going to be outdated. So just keep that in mind. And there's a lot of uncertainty around this entire topic before Trump actually takes office in January 2025. So briefly first, a few months ago, there was an announcement from the current White House administration, so Biden-Harris. So this is the administration that's going out as Trump is coming in. And they were announcing a more restrictive approach to thinking about small parcel customs declaration or just immediate like direct parcel customs declaration from not only China, but just importing to the US in general. So currently there is actually a threshold of $800 declared on a parcel or shipment basis, where if you're under that, then it completely completely skips the customs declaration process. So what Biden and Harris announced, and this was a formal White House announcement, was that they were going to restrict that, what some call a loophole. They want to address illegitimate businesses or businesses misdeclaring or trying to avoid import taxes in terms of that reducing or minimizing or maybe even taking away that $800 threshold. So that was a previous announcement, and that was a topic of our previous podcast. Now that Trump has won the presidency, is coming in, all of that previous announcement actually pretty much goes out the window. And what Trump's approach is, and it always was during his candidacy, was more tariffs on pretty much everyone. And a very specific messaging he had before was much higher tariffs on China or anyone else that's considered to be detrimental to U.S. trade and U.S. imports. And there were some numbers floating around where he wanted to increase tariffs from China up to 60% total, which is quite high, right? And now he's starting to make more announcements as it becomes closer to his presidency on what he's actually going to do. Now, I will highlight that there is a lot of uncertainty in what these announcements will actually mean in terms of reality, what the numbers will actually be. So just keep that in mind as you listen to this podcast or watch this content, that a lot of what we're saying right now is our current view as of the end of November. It might still change. However, we will provide a point of view on the current situation itself. So now, Simon, before we talk more about the updated tariffs potentially itself, I think it would be helpful for the viewer to really understand what these tariffs are on and what that implies. So these are specifically import tariffs. And Simon, you being from the EU, you also are experienced with VAT, right? You also has import tariffs. In the US, it's not VAT, but there's sales taxes as well, which sellers have been on the hook for the entire time. Now, given your past experience, especially with freight forwarding and bulk imports, could you just describe for us like what this actually is and what might the difference be between, let's say, the similar kind of update that we had in the EU VAT in the last couple of years?
Besides the EU in the last couple of years, I was also involved with the import into China for cross-border e-commerce, which was also a very big update, not per se an upgrade, but an update on how to perceived cross-border shipments in general into China. And the same a few years later happened into Europe, where I helped kickstart a custom clearance company to facilitate Amazon shipments into Europe, but also small parcel shipments into Europe. I was heavily involved with that on a day-to-day basis. And when that announcement came, that was already since 2015. I was involved since 2015 with small parcels entering the EU, but also entering into China. It's very interesting to learn how much resistance there always is for every country when there is a regulation change on import tariffs or duties or taxes, for whatever name you want to give it. There was a lot of resistance, mainly with the sellers. And the consumers were pretty much in the end informed and just had to accept it. I didn't hear many consumers in China nor in Europe complaining that these tariffs were being implemented back in the days. But for the sellers itself, it was a very stressful experience because it's a black hole where they don't really know how they can still get their own margin, how they can secure their business for the long term, how they can secure their brand. But everything took a lot of time. And even in Europe, the regulations in Europe was 2021, July 2021, when it was implemented. We're now in end of 2024, and there's still things that needs to be fixed. There's still long way to go for it to be fully without any loopholes or without any gaps to make sure it's running efficiently. And that's also what I would say when it comes to the US. When the announcement comes, the implementation also still needs to happen. And obviously, Trump is already trying to make the announcements earlier, so there may be some steps can be prepared in advance. EU is even more difficult because there were multiple countries involved, and each country has to comply with their own tax offices that needs to commit with it as well. Data exchange across different countries with their own regulations, with their own VAT percentages. So I would say the US will ramp up faster than what we saw happening in the EU. But it's still going to take a little bit for a while. I would say, some say up to 12 months. It depends. In the end, the situation in the US is probably a little bit different. It's also his last term probably as a president. So it's also going to be interesting, I would say, to watch. But I don't have a really concern. Once the rule would be implemented, it will change for everyone without exception. So you still have a level playing field. And then it's just who's able to adjust and who still has a product that people want and still want to buy for the price that they're willing to sell it for. And I think that was the whole thing with filtering out the market from players that were actually never really profitable on the right way and just trying to build a business around loopholes. That is not something that is sustainable. And I think not just next year, but the coming years, not just the US, not just Europe, but we see all new rule regulations coming up in South America, in Mexico, in Brazil, in Canada, in Norway, in Switzerland, and Southeast Asia as well. So it's not just the US that is doing it. It is a common trend about cross-border e-commerce. Domestic countries are protecting their borders. So everything that's coming in, they want to make sure it's secure, it's safe, but it's also taxed, not in direct competition with local players. Okay, so what happened in 2021, July 2021, is about import regulations in the EU changed. So all small parcels that were entering the EU, they would had to be taxed. So before the threshold was 22 euro, just like same as the $800 in the US. That valuation, that threshold went down from 22 euro to zero. That means that all parcels entering the EU had to be taxed. And that means that technically every country, they have their own VAT percentages, their import tax percentages. And in Europe, it's a little bit separate. You have an import tax and you have a sales tax, like what Dayu said. Therefore, importing goods doesn't mean that you have to pay at the amount of the sales price. It is import based on the cost of goods, based on the declared value or CIF price, as some people call it. That is very important to understand. What is the value that you use to declare the goods at to be able to get it imported and pay the tax accordingly? Obviously, when it comes to cross-border e-commerce, everything that's entering the EU is technically also sold, and therefore there is also a sales tax that applies. And within the EU, nobody wants to pay twice, both for import and sales tax. That's why they came up with this IOSS number, this import one-stop shop number, that is purely to be able to, if you register all parcels, all orders that are coming in that belong to you as a company, as an individual company that have been sold online, they need to come into the EU with your own unique number to link it to your company. Then you don't have to pay any tax for the import, but you will have to pay tax for the actual sales. So that's kind of like where this big separation comes and what makes it sometimes confusing, where in the EU it's very common to have a different taxation as well as the import as the sales tax. And navigating that has been sometimes too complex for some sellers for good reasons to just avoid the EU. But this is something that we really also want to educate our clients of, especially when things are changing in the US. How can we still learn and be educated on what happened in the EU, but also how can we use and diversify away from the US and maybe look at different regions where there's still a big opportunity to scale.
So one key to keep in mind in this update is that these are import tariffs, or tariffs on imported goods. So this is actually very different than the concept of VAT in the EU or sales tax in the US. So both of those are calculated on the retail value that you're selling to your customers. So if you're selling something for $50, then a 22% VAT, for example, is going to be on top of that. So that's like $10 or something, or 10 euros or something, right? Now, a potentially 60% import tariff for a good from China sounds scary. However, it's based on the import value, the declared import value of the good coming into the US. Now, depending on what you're selling. So if you're selling an extremely expensive consumer electronics, I think Apple products, for example, will be more expensive, right? However, if you're selling a product with its base COGS being maybe dollars, right, or $5. And for a lot of consumer gadgets, that's going to be probably where your COGS actually lie, and therefore your declared value. So even if you have a 60% import tariff on that, that's 60% of the actual value of the imported product, not the sales price. So let's just say that $5 product, let's just say 50% to make it easy, and then it's $2.50, and then your COGS becomes $7.50, but you might be selling that product for $50 anyways. Therefore, this is a very, very important difference that everyone should realize, and why it's different from VAT update the last couple of years ago. Now, the reality is that someone's going to take the burden of that cost. And the idea from, I guess, Trump and supporters is that somehow China or some other country is going to take on that burden. Practically speaking, not really. Now, a lot of sellers are concerned that they're going to take the full burden. Practically speaking, not all of it either. Because now, especially the fact that all of America knows about this happening, and there's increasing messaging around, look, this is actually going to increase inflation. This is going to be passed on to the customers. So this is not a surprise. So I'm not saying that every seller out there is going to, be as simple as, hey, I'm going to have this increase in tariffs, and therefore I'm going to pass it directly on to the consumer. But a lot of businesses will have to do that with no choice. So just to clarify here, it's the percentage sounds very high. It's based on your product value, though, as opposed to your retail value. So as a percentage of your actual gross margins is actually not as bad, depending on what your COGS actually are going to be. And most likely, there, especially over the medium term, that cost is going to be passed on to the local US consumer. Now, not great for the consumer, but this is something to realize that it's not the sellers that are 100% need to be worried that you have to eat that cost and therefore eat that margin.
Okay, thanks for sharing a little bit of background. Hopefully you have a little bit of understanding now of where we're coming from the US, but also having a comparison when it comes to the EU. But where are we getting at now, Dayu?
So this just came in. This is as of November 26, 2024. This morning, Trump actually made an announcement updating on some of the tariffs that he certainly is going to enact right as he comes in office. So again, this is as of November 26. I'm not confident these numbers will actually maintain into January, but this is exactly what he announced today. So he said that he's going to sign an order imposing a 25% tariff, blanket tariff, on all goods coming from Mexico and Canada, and then charging China an additional, so that's key, additional 10% tariff on what exists already. So let's take that part by part. So first, the 25% on Mexico and Canada goods, that's honestly a little bit surprising, especially Canada, but also Mexico. They are supposed to be trusted trade partners. So this is kind of surprising for everyone out there. So we'll see how this plays out. I think there's going to be a lot of backlash on those kind of tariffs. But the point is that now with this messaging, it doesn't actually even seem like Trump is just targeting China at all. He's just targeting other countries. And I guess the whole point is that they want to make some money on imports, and also they want to move production more into the US. And we'll talk about the feasibility of that as well. But it seems to be shifting away from this whole concept of imposing tariffs as a punishment or a retaliatory approach to uncooperative countries. And especially Canada, I don't think ever was considered an uncooperative country. Now, what does that mean for US sellers and US consumers? One reality is that now it actually, if these are set as mentioned, it removes another channel to sell into the US. So there has been a lot of conversations around, well, if there's too high tariffs in China, then why don't we just import goods into Mexico and then ship it from Mexico into the US? Or Canada, actually. That's already a pretty common thing. So that, so this blanket tariff actually probably makes that not cost feasible. 25% on top is quite a lot. And also, it does actually hinder this supposed long-term goal of moving more production into the US. Because the thing is, like, to produce something, you also need raw materials, which means that you're either going to need to import that from China, or maybe at the time like Canada and Mexico, which are the easiest to import raw materials from. And now there are going to be tariffs on that as well. So just generally speaking, I do think that this is going to be a net negative on US consumers and actually going to hold back the goal of moving more production into the US. And this is part of the reason why, I think that once it actually gets to the point where the government is considering enacting it, I think there's going to be backlash. I do think that this is going to change as the government realizes the reality of what's happening here. And then the point around the 10% additional tariffs on China. So a key point here is additional. There's already varying tariffs on different types of goods from China, anywhere between, well, actually some are zero, but usually everywhere between 10, 15, 20% to up to 50% already, given some of the past year's tariff rulings. So that 10% for some goods may actually get those goods to 60%. Okay. But again, it's 10% additional. In the grand scheme of things, this is actually kind of a surprise because we did expect Trump to have a higher additional tariff. In this way, it does feel like, at least from the current messaging, that maybe the emphasis is less around protecting against China, but actually more against, I suppose, protecting against every other country in the world. Honestly, it's not great for the US consumer. It's probably not great for sellers going into the US. But in situations like this, one thing to remember is that in business, a lot of it is all relative. So everyone is going to get hit by this tariff. And because of that, your competitors are going to as well. No matter what anyone is doing, everyone is going to be hurt by this tariff. And that's also a big reason why I think at the end of the day, the cost of these tariffs are most likely going to be passed on to the consumer, because all of the players in the industry importing these products are going to be hit with the same cost, and they just can't really survive necessarily sometimes without actually passing on the cost to the actual consumers themselves.
Yeah, exactly. In the end as well, we have to see how the consumer responds, because in the end, one of the key things in his candidacy was also to really protect the borders. And I think that's why some of the people voted for him, to be able to, because they, I guess, agree with it. But then there's a consequence when you protect the borders and things has to happen created domestically or being taxed, then things start to become more expensive. And that will be interesting to watch. But for a brand owner then, because we're talking about sellers will be impacted, consumers will be impacted. I can understand how consumers will feel the impact, and that will obviously translate to sellers. How would you distinguish that? Because you have sellers, but you also have brands. So do you see that a distinction need to be made on where the potential impact lies, maybe heavier on one side or the other? Let's take an Amazon seller, or a Shopify seller, a brand owner, like where will be impacted? When
we're talking about seller, or maybe when we're talking about just a seller of products, more generic products, maybe some private labeling. And I do think that this is where, unless you actually have an established brand, a brand following, this is potentially where you get hit the most. Because the thing about, like, if you actually have an established brand connection with a customer, we've seen this over the last couple of years with rising inflation. I mean, like restaurants, right? Like fast food. Fast food is no longer cheap anywhere in the world. Fast food is actually quite expensive over the last couple of years because of inflation, right? I mean, I'm not the biggest fan, but like McDonald's is like twice as expensive as before, but people still buy it. Like people still actually like go to these fast food restaurants and pay for it. However, a lot of smaller, medium-sized, like similar businesses have really been struggling because they've had to increase their prices, and because there's nothing too special about like their specific food, then they're actually losing customers to their competitors who have a more loyal following, who actually pay for the additional price that inflation has caused. So that's inflation, right? Now, this is going to cause basically the same thing because of the cost of the initial inputs. The imported products are going to be higher, then either companies are going to have to stomach the margin, and a lot of companies can't, or they have no choice but to pass it on. Now, if you're talking about like a brand that people actually love, then we've seen it over and over again. Even if you raise prices by some dollars, $5, $10, as long as the perceived value is still within that customer's range, then they'll still be able to purchase it, right? However, if you're selling more generic products, if you're like more of a generic FBA seller and like it's always a constant battle for your margins, this is where like if you try to pass on those costs, and your consumers might actually then find alternative, better, maybe slightly more expensive options because it's a brand. So this is one important note to just more and more the importance of building a brand where consumers will buy from you no matter what, where they might be a little bit less price sensitive because of their connection with your brand.
Yeah, because actually when the consumer prices go up, consumers are generally smart. And I saw that happening actually in China. Due to import regulations into China years ago, things became more expensive to buy domestically. And that same product could be bought overseas for a lower price than you can buy domestically. Therefore, what happened? You got these overseas shoppers that are buying it for you in a country where it's cheaper, put it in a parcel, and send it out through a postal network back into China. And this is one of the key things as well to realize, is that when that announcement came earlier this year about the Minimis, but also about the tariffs, will that impact postal channels, or will that only impact commercial channels, which are run by express companies or parcels? Because there's still some form of C2C shipments, consumer to consumer, that are sent by postal that maybe are less subject or no longer subject to comply. This is a whole discussion that's happening within the postal organization, the UPU, on what that input would be for the postal channels. So consumers are generally smart. So if a product becomes more expensive in the US or anywhere in the world, you can find it cheaper somewhere else, it tends to find a way to kind of still get the same product for a better price into the country until that loophole is closed again. And I've seen that happen in the past 8 years in China, where the loophole existed and it was closed probably 3 or 4 years later, after really big businesses have been created in these 3-4 years, just to be able to leverage that postal channel to the fullest and build a commercial business. So it's not like when the tariffs are announced that everything suddenly changes. You cannot. I have seen it happen in the EU, in China as well, that there are still gaps that need to be closed to be fully have that level playing field. And that means it's not going to be an overnight change. The announcement happens and then everyone complies and it becomes the norm, the standard.
So Simon, that's a great point. So historically, we have seen that consumers are going to sometimes find smart, relative, cheaper options in terms of getting goods, in terms of these additional tariffs or taxes. And actually, particularly recently in the US, you have actually increasing options that consumers are aware of. So for example, the likes of Shein and Temu. And then generally speaking, more and more consumers are actually aware that they can actually purchase from brands that ship directly from China. Now, so this is where we do get a question a lot around, well, how does this actually impact parcel shipping from China? My point of view is that because these tariffs are actually blanket tariffs on everything, that first of all, it means that no matter if you're shipping from China or you're importing goods into the US and then shipping within the US, this technically affects everyone on a blanket basis, right? So certainly it does not make it more attractive for you to offer local fulfillment, particularly because where this policy is going to be the easiest to enact in terms of additional tariffs is through bulk import of goods. There's no additional policies that need to be updated in order to enact this higher tariff. Because if you're shipping a container to the US, like it's already going through this formal customs duty process. So all they need to do is increase the rate. So nothing actually changes. However, the nature of small parcel shipping directly from China to the US or to any country is that there are actually more efficient ways to fast clear customs. And one really important method right now is still the de minimis ruling, where if your parcel or package is under $800 in declared value, technically it's still going to get through scot-free. And there is no current announcement from Trump, at least, that that's going to change. Now, previously, that was a concern with Biden and Harris's announcement that they were going to be more restrictive in terms of that threshold. So that was actually something that fundamentally could have actually impacted the efficiency of China parcel shipping into the US. But as far as we know, that's not on Trump's radar. So it is actually very possible that even if these tariffs get enacted January 2025, and all import of goods through normal channels over $800 is going to be hit with higher costs from China and probably from other countries as well. Unless we hear otherwise, there is actually no mechanism to remove that $800 threshold. So in the near term, maybe the medium term, you could actually, as a seller or a brand, actually have a competitive edge using this method of smart parcel shipping to ship from China. And again, more and more consumers are actually used to getting products from China. More and more consumers use Temu, more and more consumers use Shein. So no longer is it as much of a negative thing to ship from China. And I do potentially think that at least in the next year or so, like if this tariff gets enacted, then probably more brands and sellers realize that it's actually more competitive to ship parcels directly from China, given the $800 de minimis threshold. Actually, it's not even a real loophole. Like I'm careful of like talking about loopholes because loopholes can always be closed. Now, this is a little bit more formal than just like a loophole because it's a literal threshold that the U.S. Customs has declared to say that anything under $800, you just skip the customs process. And why is that, by the way? The reason why that was enacted has nothing to do with benefiting China imported goods. That's not the point. The point is that it actually takes a lot of resources to declare customs for an individual parcel. The analysis actually shows that if the US had to actually scrutinize every single parcel, then the potential proceeds from that actually is not nearly as much as the potential costs of additional systems, additional manual work to actually scrutinize each parcel. And so that's exactly why there's that $800 threshold. It's actually to save money on customs net. So this is also why, like, as we think about like what's coming up, unless we hear like some very, very strong regulations otherwise, I do actually think that it could cause in the near term over the next year or so a competitive advantage to actually ship or continue to ship your parcels from China to US consumers and declare it under $800. Well, because your retail value is going to be $800 for that parcel anyways to your consumer.
Like you mentioned already, Dayu, that there's not just against China, it's also Mexico and Canada that are sometimes considered as a hub, as an entry point into the US. But there's some of the questions we get, okay, what if the production is shifting because China is too risky or too costly? Let's move it to Southeast Asia or another area to be able to move that production. Then the question is actually, maybe the production is cheaper in another country, but maybe not the shipping. And I think that's a lot of people that are overlooking this aspect, that it's when you make the comparison, yeah, maybe your product can be produced somewhere else. Maybe you're going to have less tariffs that you have to deal with because maybe the origin is not China, but somewhere else. You have to consider also the shipping cost. And so far, we haven't found any country that is shipping as efficient, as affordable as China to the rest of the world. And that's just the reality. So we have to make the comparison. When you start adding tariffs, when you start to add the component of the origin, is it still, bottom line, more effective to ship from China? Not just from the operational cost, but also the actual cash flow that you need to build your business. How much inventory does have to be on the way before you can start selling? How much capacity, how many resources you need to plan all these goods that need to be moved cross-border? And that's a very important component that is when we isolate the tariffs discussion, we tend to forget maybe other aspects that are very relevant and probably maybe even more impactful to compete, but also diversify, but also to be able to still have a long-term sustainable business. All right, that's all for this episode. We will make sure to keep you updated going forward. Whenever we hear something, you will hear from us. Make sure to follow us also on LinkedIn. Follow myself, Simon, but also Dayu. That's probably the first place that we're going to announce any updates, any point of view about the real impact. There's a lot of noise out there. We're trying to keep it real here. So please do follow and like and subscribe to this podcast. Hope you enjoyed this one. Let us know what your takeaway is and what you think the regulations and the tariffs impact is going to be.